last conversation this afternoon will be between Aspen Mays and Karsten Lund.
So, as you know, but everyone else may not, this is kind of a particularly fun conversation to be having publicly, because we've been having kind of fairly regular and sometimes intense kind of conversations with each other for at least 5 years, like first in Chicago, and then across continents via Skype when you were in Chile, and now kind of across time zones now that you're in Ohio and LA or here. And the timing, as mentioned, is also kind of fortuitous because I ended up just not really in the past couple months kind of revisiting a bunch of your recent work and kind of writing about some of the things you've done coming out of that shape as well. Which means that we could probably sit up here and talk for 4 hours or talk really, really, really fast. But I think it might be a good place to start kind of with some of the work that you have here, partially because it's new to me until very, very recently. And obviously it's on you and you've seen it, and we do not have any images. And then, but I would kind of like to look back and talk about some of your other recent work too. We can kind of describe some of that, particularly because I think through both new work and that work, we start kind of opening up into various different ideas that do relate to this question of histories and photography and things like that as well. So yeah, the works we see here. We end up seeing these very kind of enigmatic photograms. You, of course, like many people here probably know, they are very specific tools. We have these dodging tools, and they're recognizable. But even among kind of people schooled in photography, we can all kind of predict that they won't be recognizable for long necessarily. I think, which to me is something. It's one of the first interesting things too. But I kind of want you to talk about where these come out of, and then I have a couple of other kind of observations which maybe I may or may not share, and then keep on going. But so yeah, tell me kind of what your interest is in kind of turning to these very specific kind of tools that you've been collecting, kind of mentioned here as well, and kind of what the impetus is and what really is to you in kind of presenting these to us in this way.
Yeah, so it's fun to talk about them in this crowd because this is, the in crowd of photo people. I feel like almost everyone here could recognize them as dodging tools. It was funny, we were talking, I told a person I had a studio visit, and I just had them all out in my studio, and somebody was like, are these used for bad things? Because they're white, and they, in a certain light, they're kind of, and they're so crude often, as you all know. And he was, like, what have you been using these for? So they're a little like torture devices. That big one is a big styrofoam plate with a pencil taped to it. So they're so amazing because they're always so immediate. They're so not a lot of thoughts put into them. I mean, they're supposed to be really practical. And what's been fun about finding them is that often people don't bother to throw them away. If you go in a dark room, there's tons of prints in the garbage can, but the tools are, people keep the dodging tool, and they don't do it for themselves. They leave it in that space to get reused, which is kind of a strange thing to think about. But I started collecting them when I was in Chile on a Fulbright, and I was using this old dark room that was no longer in use at this astronomical observatory. And it was a struggle, kind of, listening to what Adam was just saying too. There's this disconnect, this equipment that is being used to do all this observation that felt like totally illegible to, anyone but these physicists that were using it. And so then I was going back into this dark room and feeling like I had no idea what to do with all this. And then you see these little tools that are so pathetic. And, the one that I kept in that one was like a spatula. Just as like you imagine people making them to serve this immediate purpose, and some sort of are almost like the lock and key, where they really are made for a specific image that needs to be modified, and some are just for more general purpose. But I was really attracted to how goofy they were, and so I just started collecting them. And that was always one of my favorite things when I first learned how to print in the dark room. That was the dance party moment of making it. Image you would always have like music on in there, and then dodging and burning happens, and it's like the part where you're moving around in the dark that is so ridiculous, And I love and I'm teaching a darkroom class right now, and the students are so excited to learn all this technical information, and then all of a sudden you're like, but actually you have to make this really janky tool out of a coat hanger, and that's how you're going to make a good print. And this, all that play, so they're meant to be sort of funny, but they're also, like you said, they're also, and when you're using it properly, it's invisible. You're never supposed to see it. And even here in these photographs, you see its outline, you still don't see the thing itself, but you're never supposed to see the dodging and burning tool. If it's used properly, it's always invisible.
Yeah. I think even in what you kind of described so far, it starts pointing to a whole bunch of these other things. And this is something that I like about these works. And I would say maybe in general about your work, there's in a certain level of kind of simplicity to it, but it starts to become really complex, and also even you can start to even read it metaphorically in a certain way too, you know. So, I mean, if you think about these as the most ad hoc kind of tools within this general kind of system that involves these incredibly sophisticated apparatuses, you know, I like the fact that in these photographs, there's also a very kind of simple form of making photographs in a certain way. It's almost like taking the tool to its most extreme use, you know. It's like if you just leave it there, this is what you get.
Right.
But then in the process, kind of, I don't know, I started thinking about it, like it's almost staging its own disappearance, you know. So like you take it away and you get this form that's like over, you know. But I don't know, I think it's really interesting also that this kind of starts out of kind of time, the moments that when you were in Chile and working in this particular art group too, you know. So I'm curious about, I don't want to necessarily segue too quickly into the other work, but I think it is kind of related to where it's both these very kind of general objects, you know, but they are also both very specific, as you said, sometimes highly tailored to a certain image even, and these kind of things too. But like this kind of push and pull in your work in general, and sort of in between, starting with these very kind of specific moments or even archives, you want to say, a darkroom, an existing darkroom can be an archive of its own,
Right.
you know, what it leads to, I guess.
Yeah, and I think part of what's interesting too about them often is that you feel like the darkroom kind of can cannibalize itself to make them. They're often made from things in the darkroom, you know, like lids of paper, and you know, I have a couple that have the film canister rings that have been taped on. You know, they're oftentimes the darkroom itself gets turned into the material to make it. And the ones that I had been using in Chile, the ones that I found, I made a piece where one was a little half circle. And of course, I think in that case, I wanted them all to be celestial because they felt like, of course they were, you know, like they're printing pictures of suns and stars, and you know, they would be made to modify those types of images, whether or not they were. And that's what I found a few that were diamond shaped, which felt very, you know, I don't know. You know, that part's really interesting too, that they would be made that way.
So again, yeah, and I think that segues a little bit to where we're thinking about a darkroom that exists in some ways for a very specific purpose. It's at this observatory, you know, it's a darkroom that's operated by these professional astronomers and these kind of things too, but I think it's very interesting thinking about what you were saying, kind of cannibalizing its own kind of materials in a way, and you're imagining this stuff being cut out of discarded prints and things like that too, you know. I mean, that very quickly, I think, starts to take us to some of the other things you did with those, for the works you found. And this is what we'll do instead of but it's appropriate though, because I think really what we're dealing with in that work, and in these works too, is that you're dealing with like photographs in their most material kind of photographs as these printed papers. So I don't know if you want to describe this a little bit, kind of what we're actually looking at.
Yeah, sure. And I think
And even from a distance, you can kind of still get a sense of what it is, particularly with the description.
right, and I think formally, I mean, there's a certain formal function, certainly with the silhouette of the dodging and burning tools, that very much they resemble this work in so many ways. And I wanted them to be kind of formal studies that, almost like pictograms or something. You don't quite know what thing is being depicted, but you know, maybe it's some kind of code or something. I don't know, maybe it adds up to its own language or something like that. But the work that Kristen was just showing was work from that same darkroom that I've been using. And the dodging and burning tools I've just been collecting now, and people send me them. Often, you know, I make students make them. And then, you know, I kind of walk around the darkroom. Afterwards, like, that one's great. You know? So I never make them myself, I guess I should say too. I always just kind of wait to find them. But this work, I had found all these discarded prints in the darkroom in this observatory, and then I took out all the stars with a hole punch. So again, I also thought the hole punch is this really crude, you know, it's a really basic tool. And I really, I guess I really like office products too, is what I also realized. Yeah, anyway. So I took them all out, and they become maps.
They're star maps. I think that's like the key thing that I don't know if you said, like the photographs of the stars in the sky, I think too. So then that becomes kind of the system, right, to figure out what is a limit.
Right, and they become masks themselves. You know, they become this other thing that you could print through, or a lot of astronomers, they'll make they'll have masks made that they slip into these telescopes, so that they're blocking out certain areas, that they want to only look at certain things or certain stars or certain objects. So there's all this masking that's built into that looking as well, which I think those kind of become part of that, or at least a little bit. But right, it's about the information that I've removed, and I think that the dodging tools are still part of that too. There's still something about what's removed. Of course, that's something part that's getting exposed to. You know, there's that push and pull. That's interesting.
I mean, and just to like,
Just to have story time.
story time, yes. This is also, I think, in the context of thinking about this work and those pieces in there, but maybe even especially these, like in the context of a show like this, we're thinking about photographies in relation to histories or history or whatever kind of concepts there. I mean, I started looking at these almost in a different way too, and started thinking more kind of intently about the fact that these are what is left over, and it becomes this analog to almost what photography does itself too, where it's this constant process and go into this continuous world, and you make these kind of selections. So I started seeing these as these kind of maps of what's left. This is everything in between, in a sense, as opposed to the points of interest, I guess, too.
Right.
You know, for like, I don't know. I mean, there's something to be said about kind of the process of history too. I think, and when you started to decide on what are the points of interest, and kind of what are the things you're looking at, how do you start building these larger stories. Again, it kind of starts this process of what you're looking at, what you aren't, and things like that too, you know. And for those kind of works too, we're looking at these photographs from very particular times as well, I think. So I'm interested in the way that in your work, these various different kind of registers of time start coming out, you know. Like you could imagine there's the time in the darkroom that you spend standing over the photograph, but there's also, you know, these are photographs from a very particular time that you're finding long after the fact, I think. So I don't know if you can kind of say a little bit about the ways that these things start to pile up on each other.
Yeah, I think in that work in particular, there's also kind of the cosmic time, the cosmic scale of what we're actually, what these people are looking at, what astronomers, what we're trying to see in space. So there's, what was kind of really fascinating about being in that dark room, which I guess is so obvious, but it really struck me when I was there that it was just full of boxes and boxes of Kodak plates that had been treated. And you know, it was right, like, of course, there was a moment that these came into existence and they were sensitive enough to record what needed to be recorded. But they really are keyed into this moment in time in a way that they're seen, in a way of seeing that is really specific. And now it's changing, and now it's something else. And you know, there's a lot of innovations in photography have often been connected to astronomy. A lot of CCD technology is connected to a need to build more sensitive telescopes. You know, so there's always been a relationship, I think, to those two technologies. Yeah, but then of course it's keyed into this thing where what was interesting too about finding all of these prints is that none of them were labeled. A lot of them were literally in trash cans, or I found something behind a desk. I mean, they had all been discarded. They didn't have a science value at all, or they would have been protected or saved or something like that. So finding them and having them be unlabeled. I mean, I had brought down a few of the astronomers that worked there. And none of it, there's just no way to know, like, yeah, that's a picture of stars. Like, that's all we got. You know, we don't know where we were looking, what we were looking at. I mean, there's just no way. They all look, they're indistinguishable at a certain point, you know, and so to take them out, I really wanted that whole thing, all that looking to feel as fragile as it actually is. And that was part of the interest in taking them away.
And I like also kind of related to that you're almost looking at like the remnants and the fragments of these systems, or at least these very systematic ways of looking, you know. So I think the astronomers especially are taking a very empirical kind of approach to using photography, right? But then you said there's all this kind of detritus that's left over, you know, that someone has made the value. This is not useful to us. Either it duplicates something or it doesn't tell you anything. Who knows, I think. So, and there's that kind of push and pull between these two different kind of sides of what photography can do in these instincts that I think especially in writing the piece for Context, you kind of started to feel like it's really alive in this work and other things before and after you've done it, you know. So, I mean, we've talked about kind of in the context of that, these questions of objectivity or subjectivity, and you kind of described it at some point as like the fantasy of objectivity, and I'm wondering maybe if you could say a little bit about that, kind of how that way of thinking about those kind of questions came out of this work a little bit too.
Yeah, I think that's always been one of my primary interests in photography, that it really, more than anything else, speaks to a fantasy of that something could be objective. That it stands in for that. It's the act of photographing is about tapping into that fantasy, like, right, this will be the thing that is objective, and we can have it, and we can look at it. And I think that fantasy is so compelling, and I think it's so compelling in science and astronomy too. It feels like it gets to speak from that place of authority. it's comforting in that way and totally terrifying in that way. And I think that was also part of what I was thinking about in doing that, is to reintroduce and really aggressively reintroduce my hand in a way that was violent, to actually remove all of that. And I guess that's probably part of the appeal of this dodging tool, right? That the hand is so, and they're so pathetic, they're so human in the midst of all of this stuff, the apparatus. Yeah.
And that becomes this other register of time almost too. Imagine you sitting there over and over again, so repetitively, particularly as you see the images start stacking up. You've done this sheet after sheet after sheet after sheet, and then I start projecting this off into eternity, and then suddenly all the stars are gone and we're in darkness and none of this exists. But,
Sorry.
why would we do that?
Should we talk about our fantasy project that we never did in June?
Yeah, I think we're probably gonna run out of time. Well, I think maybe here's the thought too. Like there's the fantasy of activity, like that kind of phrase is a really interesting one. I think it points to something that we can all kind of recognize. Like, okay, it's really hard to come up with something that is this absolutely certifiable, objective truth. We deal with photography as if it were any kind of verbal evidence, but we all know a little bit better. But we do learn things, and it is evidence in a certain sense too. But I like thinking how like this starts to add up to this kind of cumulative sense of knowledge in a way too, but this also constantly self-validating. It's like, which that, I don't know, to me, that, yeah, let's talk about we're going to talk about a project that we almost did together. So this is our going back in history a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think it does relate to that too. Because like in some ways the project we were going to do is something that responds to this kind of historical echo, but also these kind of larger giants that are kind of the knowledge that we can build on, like so Charles Darwin specifically. But like I think this is your story first and foremost, so you should definitely tell it.
All right, I think we still have this. Okay, so this was our fantasy project that we didn't get to do. So when I was living in Chile, 5 days after I got there, there was that huge earthquake in 2010, and it was just a really shocking experience. And I think in many ways it ended up being really related to the work that I made from that here, because it was, even when it was happening, it was an 8.8 earthquake. It lasted 2.5 minutes, which is a really long time to be pretty sure that you're gonna die. It's like, okay, when is this gonna, and it was just so violent. I'd never experienced anything like that. I mean, intellectually, the earthquakes are possible, but I just never thought of something that violent happening in the earth. And it was the moment also of feeling like suddenly these processes, like really deep time was suddenly evident. These things that are happening, and then it was so real and so unbelievably violent. So when I was living in Chile, I also was reading Charles Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle, which is really just the whole thing is basically set in Chile. He's only in the Galapagos Islands for a little tiny bit at the very end of the voyage. And the beagle, oh, what a cute, it's just such a, I don't know. Anyway, that's not
It's about this big.
Exactly. It's really cute. Anyway, so, and I was reading that, I had brought that book to read, and I was reading into this experience, and Darwin experienced a really violent earthquake in Chile also, and I felt this kinship through
The
history.
crazy thing though is almost 150 years earlier to the day.
Right, it was
same week in February pretty much. So already there we're dealing with what feels like this crazy historical echo, and he was almost in the same place.
Yeah, I got, then I just felt like we had shared this moment through the ages. And it was also kind of, and the Voyage of the Beagle was also really around the time of the invention of photography, but there are no photographs of that trip. There were all these things that then Carson and I started thinking that we would go back. We would go to all the places that Darwin had
It
visited.
describes in a handful of places kind of around that area where
Really specifically, and also part of and he describes the earthquake as also having that moment of realizing something about deep time, some forces at play here. And that became really interesting as well, and seeing the stratification of rock in the Andes was part of all. You see all the seeds being planted for what of course became the theory of evolution. So Chris and I were going to go together and photograph all these places.
And the strange thing about kind of these passages in the Voyage of the Beagle is that, we think of Darwin as the scientist, but when you actually read the writing of these kind of descriptions, it switches kind of back and forth between almost this very lyrical mode and then sometimes a very kind of cold-eyed description of these kind of things too. But it seemed like a very interesting foil for a kind of photographic project. Because on one hand, we're dealing with something that does point us to certain places, but it's not concrete in a certain way. There's a lot of guesswork that's involved too, you know, so, I don't know, there's something about that in this this like, essentially at that moment, this transition to the existence of photographing was all, you know, this very different world, you know, so that exact scientific voyage probably would have been very different even 15 years later, maybe not that, but like, you know, you imagine as decades go by, you know.
Right, having something like this, like the Western, like the, you know, expedition photographs that we know about, that we have, that the document that they formed. And yeah, it really does read, I guess that kind of goes back to what we were talking about ideas of objectivity. I mean, it really does also read like a travel, I mean, it is also his diary. You know, and it's like, oh, today was such a beautiful day, and we were walking. You know, there's also this part of you also think of him as a young man, just having this really huge experience at the same time.
So I mean, there is this push and pull between these kind of moments where he breaks the objective mold a little bit and gets very subjective. It's very kind of personal descriptions in a way. But like, I don't know, I like how that swivels us back then to the challenges of trying to do a project like this too, whereas like in some ways we're trying to do this kind of historical recreation, knowing that a lot has changed in 150 years, both in the ways you do it and even these places themselves too. So in a way that seems really relevant to kind of a show that deals with photographies and histories, suddenly becomes this matter of traces in some kind of way too. Like I've been thinking a lot recently about kind of, okay, well, what do you actually see in these photographs? When it exists kind of in the register of evidence. But there's also like, in certain photographs at least, to a certain extent, you could argue in all of them, there is something enigmatic too. So the question of what you see and what you don't, this relates back to other things that people talk about, like what is left out as part of this. There's all of these kind of things that to me start to become like one of the really rich, interesting things when you start thinking about like history, photography, what happens here, you know. But how do you think, let's speculate, like, if we had gone taken those photographs, what would have happened with this?
I don't know, we would be really famous by now.
That's a better answer than
Yeah. I think we should still do it. We should still go.
So if anybody would like to fund this project,
Yeah.
this is all an elaborate ploy, actually.
Yeah.
It's still fundraising.
Yeah.
Maybe we
We'll pass
should,
the hat in a second.
maybe we should open some questions. I feel like we just planted like 17,000 signposts. It's something we'd have to talk about entirely on its own.
Right.
I don't necessarily have a very specific question, but maybe a sort of like topic to sort of touch on. So Alison, I think your work often think of scientific imagery as this like a prosthetic of sorts, in the sense of creating a boundary maker, so to speak, in regards to epistemology. And I'm curious to, so it's sort of more of a verb in the sense that action is sort of participating in. I'm curious to your thoughts on that and sort of if that epistemology in that role, how that plays in your work and sort of strategies to be able to add it if that is one.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, I think I certainly, that was a well-phrased question, to think about some of these things. And I mean, I do look at a lot of those, and I guess that was sort of what I was hinting at earlier. They get to speak from such a place of authority. You know, they get to just be treated in a really different way. And I love starting to try to circle around that and try to look at that and to do anything I can to reposition it. Yeah, when I showed some of this work to the astronomers in Chile, a lot of them, I did this whole talk and I showed them all of it, and I was really nervous that they would say, like, I was looking for that print for 50 years. It's ruined. And of course they didn't say any of that, and a lot of them at the end, you know, so many ways had a question at the end, like, oh, I need some illustration posters. Like, I'm going to go to this conference. Do you do posters? Do you do a poster? Did you see what I did? I don't think I'm the person that should do a poster for you. But it was this kind of interest, you know, and of course, I realized that I don't want to illustrate anything, right? I don't want to use that equipment to then make an image or something like that. I want to position those images, to try to position with that authority they get to speak from, and, you know, and really poke holes in it or try to reposition it or do something with it. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, it's more of a comment. I just came from, there was a lecture this week at the Art Institute about electroacoustical music. The guy's name is Blair Kane or something. He talked about the signature of the performer. He's trying to analyze this music according to what he calls kinetic analysis, and trying to conjure the performer from listening to old recordings. And he's talking about people like Pierre Schaeffer and these guys who do things like use turntables like the 50s that's sort of what we do with photographs. We just see the result, and we think about those things. But I really enjoy your photographs because it kind of conjures the performer. You know, the photographer is conjured there as a body, even though it's an abstract piece. It's very interesting, you know, especially with the dodging and verticals in particular. But then I realized also with the hole punch, I just you know, you could imagine it
Yeah.
moving around the photograph. It's very
Yeah, that was the note. Remember we were going to talk about.
There's so many other things.
Yeah, we had been we had talked yesterday a little bit about an idea of like the magician and what
Yeah, so,
do you remember that thing?
I don't know if anybody else went to, I mean, Luis Kambitzer did a talk at Gallery 400 a couple weeks ago, and there was a couple things in there that he started saying, my brain went on fire, you know. He was kind of talking, he was making the distinction between like scientist and magician, and then kind of implicitly position the artist in between, you know, so the scientist wants to explain the incredible, and the magician is supposed to show you the incredible without any explanation at all. And he was talking about how the artist kind of incorporates the incredible to kind of broaden what is credible, you know. But then he starts getting out to these other things like, oh, mystery is like the borderline of knowledge, and artists don't have to play like cause and effect, and all these other kind of things that suddenly start to become lenses to potentially think about what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I think so, and I think that speaks to that, and I actually think that speaks to your question a little bit too, that, right, that if I'm untethered from that cause and effect, or, you know, you can actually point a little bit at the sleight of hand. I guess that's the tongue-in-cheek part of all of it, you know, that it's quite literally a sleight of hand, actually is.
So many good hand puns.
I know there's,
It's 2 times.